The sacred law in the beginning of the age of stars, when countless species learned to travel between worlds and build empires across the galaxy. There were many wars and endless conflicts, but one truth stood apart from all others, and it was whispered, first in fear and later carved in law. Never harm human children, for to do so was to invite the fury of an entire species that did not forgive and never forgot the pain of their young being touched. Humanity was different from many races in the galaxy. They had risen on a world that was fierce and merciless, where survival meant strength. But what gave them true power was not only their weapons or ships, it was the way they protected their own, especially their children. Human children were considered sacred not only by humans themselves but by the whole galaxy. Because every time some foolish alien commander or pirate dared to strike at them, disaster followed. Entire fleets had been erased. Entire species had begged for mercy because humanity's response was always absolute and unstoppable. Long ago, before the Council was formed, there had been an invasion on a small frontier colony of humans. The attackers believed the humans were weak because their fleet was far away, and the colony only had civilians and children. The aliens came in great numbers and they thought their victory was certain. But what they did not expect was the rage of every human ship in nearby sectors, rushing with engines burning at impossible speeds, pilots flying until their hands bled. Soldiers landing with no fear, entire armies assembled in days just for one purpose: to bring back the children and punish the guilty when the battle was over. The invaders had no fleet, no capital, no homeworld. The humans did not simply win. They erased the threat so thoroughly that the galaxy trembled at the sight. After that war, the first Galactic Council was formed with representatives of the major species, and one of the very first laws agreed upon was clear and written in words that carried the weight of survival. The first law of the galaxy: no one under any condition shall harm human children. It was not a request. It was a command. And the punishment for breaking it was destruction. Every alien leader nodded because they remembered the stories, and even those who doubted dared not test it. For centuries, this law was respected, and it became a pillar of peace. Whenever new species joined the Council, they were told the law, and they followed it because it was not only politics, it was survival. Whenever some small raider or outlaw ignored the rule, they vanished. When smugglers tried to use human children as leverage, they disappeared and their names were erased from history. So the galaxy learned generation after generation that this law was unbreakable, and that humans would never allow even one child to be harmed without consequences. But with time, memory grows dull, and arrogance begins to rise. New generations of Council leaders, who had not lived through those old wars, began to question why one species should be feared so much. They whispered that perhaps the humans had grown soft. Perhaps their fleets were not as strong as before. Perhaps they would not truly rise again. If provoked slowly, the whispers turned into secret talks, and those talks turned into hidden plans. On Earth itself, humanity lived peacefully, and their children played under skies, guarded by satellites and fleets in orbit, unaware of the brewing storm. But across the halls of the Council chamber far away, some voices grew louder, insisting that the law was a myth and a chain that kept the other species beneath human pride. They argued that if the Council broke the law once, just once, they would prove the humans were only bluffing. Others protested, warning of the cost. But the seeds of betrayal had already been planted, and in the silence of cold stars a shadow began to gather, one that would soon test the law that had held the galaxy together for so long: the forbidden decision. Inside the towering chambers of the Galactic Council, the debate had raged for weeks. The vast room was filled with voices from every corner of the known galaxy, some with scaled faces, some with luminous eyes, others with wings or shells, but all with ambition and fear whispering about the first law. The chamber itself was a marvel, with walls of crystal that reflected light into endless colors and pillars carved with the history of past treaties and wars, yet on this day the beauty of the place was drowned out by the tension inside it. The first law of the galaxy had kept the peace for centuries, and every representative knew why it had been written. They had all grown up hearing the stories of human retaliation, the way entire fleets had vanished, the way proud empires had been reduced to ashes. Yet the new generation of leaders had not seen it with their own eyes. They believed the stories were exaggerated myths spread by humans to keep their power above others. And so they began to argue that no single species should command such fear, in a council meant to unite all. The loudest voice belonged to Chancellor Vanar of the Reloth, a tall creature with translucent skin that revealed blue veins glowing faintly beneath. He spoke with pride and disdain, saying the galaxy must no longer bend to the threats of humans. We must test the so-called unbreakable law. If it is nothing but legend, then our council is weak. If it is real, then perhaps we should not fear them, for so long the humans have hidden behind their law. While the rest of us carried the burden of wars and disputes, some voices rose in protest. Among them was Ambassador Theron of the Yalari, who warned with trembling words that breaking the law was madness. She spoke of archives showing what happened to the species that once harmed human children. She begged the chamber to remember the truth, but her warnings were drowned out by those who hungered for proof, and by those who believed humanity's power had faded. At last a vote was called. The chamber fell silent, as glowing orbs representing each species lit up one by one: green for consent, red for refusal. The majority slowly shifted to green until the U-Boid great circle was awash with approving light when the last orb shone. The decision was clear. The council had chosen to break the first law. Their plan was whispered in shadowed corners. A small group of human children had been identified on a distant frontier colony they were unguarded for. The colony was peaceful and far from the core worlds. It would be easy to take them. The attack would be disguised as the work of raiders, and if humans reacted weakly, it would prove to the galaxy that the old stories were hollow. Only a few within the council chamber spoke against it, and even fewer had the courage to leave their posts to resist for fear of being marked as enemies of the majority. When the vote ended, Chancellor Vanar stood tall, his voice echoing through the chamber. Let history remember this day, the day the council broke its chains and showed that humans are no longer to be feared. He received applause from many, though their hands and wings trembled even as they clapped, for deep inside every species carried memories written in blood of what it meant to provoke humans. Still, the council's pride was stronger than their wisdom. That very night, fleets were ordered in secret, masked under the insignia of outlaw clan ships that carried cloaking devices and weapons designed for precision. Their target was not a fortress, not a fleet, not a city of soldiers, but a school where human children learned and played under the care of teachers and guardians. The attackers believed it would be simple, swift, and unnoticed on the colony. The children laughed and ran through fields beneath twin suns, unaware of the shadow closing in. Their parents worked in farms and stations, trusting in the law that had guarded them for generations. But far above, in the darkness of spaceships were descending, carrying soldiers who believed they were making history by defying the oldest commandment of the stars. In the council chamber, the decision was sealed, but in the hearts of a few who still remembered there was terror, for they knew once the first child cried, once the first human life was touched, the galaxy would no longer be the same and the storm would awaken. The first cry for help. The colony of New Dawn lay quiet under the light of its twin suns. It was a place of peace, far from the wars and struggles of the inner worlds. Families had chosen this place because it was safe, and because it carried the blessing of the first law. Here children played in open fields, their laughter echoing through the valleys, and teachers told stories of stars and exploration, never needing to warn about war or raiders, because the law promised their safety. The people believed that no power in the galaxy would ever dare touch them. But in the black sky above, the colony shadows moved. Cloaked ships slid through orbit, silent and unseen, their crews nervous and tense. For even though they carried weapons and orders from the highest council chambers, they knew the weight of what they were about to do. Many whispered among themselves that this was a curse. But orders were orders, and ambition had pushed their leaders to test the forbidden. As the sun set, the raiders descended their ships disguised with stolen insignias so that the blame would fall upon outlaw clans. Plasma cannons struck the colony's defenses, shattering them in moments. Guardians raised alarms, but their weapons were weak compared to the attackers. The skies lit with fire as the first explosions shook the land. Children screamed and ran for cover. Parents rushed to shield them, but the invaders pressed forward, relentless in their mission. Among the chaos, a young girl named Alara, only 8 years old, was pulled from the wreckage of a school. Her teacher fell shielding her, and with her last strength whispered, "Run," before the fire consumed the room. Ilara stumbled out clutching a small communicator, and with trembling fingers, she activated it. The message carried her voice broken with sobs through the void of space. "Please help us, they are taking the children. Please, somebody." The signal was faint, but it traveled farther than anyone expected. It reached a listening post, hidden on a barren moon where human scouts monitored deep space for signs of trouble. At first, the operators thought it was nothing but static until the voice of the child broke through and silence fell over the station. Grown soldiers sat frozen as they heard the words of fear from one of their own young. The first law had been broken, and they knew what it meant. The message was rushed to Earth faster than light through priority channels across the network of human colonies and fleets. Every captain, every general, and every parent who heard it felt the same chill, for the galaxy had crossed a line that no one was meant to cross: the halls of Earth's defense. Command shook with activity. Alarms were raised. Ships that had slept in orbital docks for decades were suddenly alive with engines roaring. Old captains returned to duty, and young recruits stood ready, knowing that this war would not be like any other. Back on New Dawn, the raiders rounded up children, dragging them into transports, while parents fought with bare hands to resist some invaders, hesitated, their hearts filled with unease as they looked into the frightened eyes of human children. For they remembered stories their grandparents had told about what happened when humans were angered. But still, the mission pressed forward, and the children were taken, their cries echoing in the night. News spread quickly beyond the human networks. Whispers in alien markets and ports spoke of the unthinkable. The Council had dared to break the first law. Some species trembled, others scoffed, believing the humans would remain quiet. But those who had lived long enough, those who had seen the past, began to prepare for what was coming. They warned their leaders, they packed their ships, and they prayed because they knew what would follow. On Earth, when the first footage arrived of children being taken, humanity changed in a single breath. Grief turned to rage. Sorrow turned to fire. Every leader stood together in unity, as they had not done in centuries. There was no debate, no hesitation. Only the command to rise. The first law had been broken, and the punishment would come swift and merciless. And somewhere in the depths of space, in shipyards hidden and forgotten for generations, massive war machines stirred, their hulls dark and scarred. From old battles engines powering once more, the galaxy had thought them silent relics, but they were not gone. They were waiting, and now they had awakened, for the cry of a single child had reached them, and humanity would never ignore it. The awakening of wrath. When the cry of the children reached Earth, the response was not measured or cautious, it was immediate and absolute. The halls of command filled with generals and admirals, men and women who had sworn oaths long ago, and some who had left service behind. Yet none of them hesitated, for this was not about politics or strategy. This was about the breaking of the first law, the one commandment that bound the galaxy together. Humanity gathered in unity, their voices one as they declared that vengeance would come. The shipyards around Earth and Mars, which had been silent for years now, thundered with life. Ancient battle cruisers that had slumbered in orbit lit their engines once again, their steel hulls glowing with heat as reactors. Roared to life. Fleets that had been thought retired were brought forward, patched and armed by hands that moved with desperate speed and passion. In hidden reserves, secret projects long buried by governments were revealed. Titans of war that had been held back for fear of their power now stood ready to be unleashed. Across the colonies, the news spread like fire. Parents wept, but their sorrow burned into anger. Volunteers flooded recruitment centers. Lines stretched through cities as men and women demanded to fight, not for glory, not for conquest, but for the children. Even those who had never held a weapon trained through the night. Entire industries shifted production. Overnight factories that once built farming equipment now forged weapons, ships, and armor, for there was no higher priority than the return of the young and the punishment of those who dared to break the law. Veterans of the old wars came forward. Scarred soldiers and pilots with eyes hardened by battles long past. They spoke of what happened the last time the law had been tested, and their words filled the young with resolve. Among them was Admiral Kieran, a man whose name had once been feared across the stars. He had retired to silence. But when the message of the girl reached him, he returned to command, his voice steady and his eyes burning with the fire of wrath. He swore to lead the fleets until every child was safe, or every star in the Council burned. Alien species who were allied with humans watched The awakening with awe and fear. Some remembered what it had been like to stand beside humanity in battle. They knew that when humans rose in anger, they did not stop halfway. They did not seek compromise. They sought justice, pure and unrelenting. Whispers filled the stations and marketplaces that the old power had returned, that the sleeping giant had awakened, and those who doubted the law now saw its meaning written in steel and fire. Meanwhile, on the colony of New Dawn, where the children had been taken, the survivors gathered in broken shelters. Their eyes filled with sorrow and rage, they sent messages begging for help. But they already knew in their hearts that humanity was coming. They had seen the anger of their kin before, and they knew it would come again. They held on through the night, whispering to the young that the stars themselves would soon roar with the engines of salvation. In the council chambers, fear began to spread, though many tried to mask it with pride. Chancellor Vaynor still raised his voice, insisting that humans would not dare risk war against the entire galaxy. But his words no longer carried certainty. His hands trembled when he read the reports of human fleets mobilizing faster than anyone thought. Possible intelligence agents whispered of hidden arsenals and fleets 3 times larger than expected. Yet he silenced them and demanded that the council hold strong. But deep down in the hearts of even the proudest species there was dread, for they remembered the old stories, the fleets that moved like storms, the soldiers who fought like predators. The way humans never stopped until vengeance was complete. They remembered entire homeworlds lost to fire for the crime of touching human children, and now those memories were no longer history. They were about to become reality once more. In every human city, people lit candles for the children, their prayers turning into chants of unity, songs of vengeance carried through streets, while above them warships broke through the clouds, their engines painting the sky with fire. It was not just the military that prepared, it was an entire civilization rising as one. The galaxy had seen humanity's strength in pieces before, but now it was about to see the full force of a people united by rage and grief, and nothing would stand in their way. The shattering retaliation. The silence of the stars broke when the first human fleets left orbit. They did not sneak. They did not hide. Their engines burned so bright that entire sectors could see their approach. It was not a strike meant to scare. It was a declaration of war. The humans moved like a storm, unleashed with precision and fury. Their ships, older than many of the council fleets, yet rebuilt with weapons that had been refined for generations and powered by reactors designed to burn without rest. At the front of the fleet was the dreadnought Iron Will, a vessel thought to have been decommissioned decades ago. Its black hull scarred with the marks of ancient wars, its guns silent for too long now. Awake once more under the command of Admiral Kieran, the man whose name was whispered in fear across countless systems, his voice carried through the comms, steady as stone. Today the council has broken the law. Today we remind them why that law was written. For every child taken, we bring fire. For every tear shed, we bring thunder. The first target was a council supply fortress orbiting the world of Xenar, heavily guarded by fleets of mixed-species warships. But the defenders had not expected the speed of the human advance. Within hours, the black horizon filled with human steel, wave after wave of cruisers and carriers pouring out weapons hot and shields flaring. The defenders tried to stand their ground, but the humans struck with a fury. No fleet could match. Railguns tore through shields. Plasma lances cut ships apart. Boarding parties stormed vessels with brutal efficiency. No mercy, no pause, no retreat. Reports spread across the galaxy faster than light. Entire fleets shattered in minutes. Entire garrisons erased as if they had never been there. Alien mercenaries hired to fight against the humans surrendered in droves, dropping their weapons and kneeling before soldiers who stared at them with cold, unforgiving eyes. Even pirates who had been paid to feign attacks now turned against their council masters, knowing that standing with humans was the only way to survive. On New Dawn, the captured children sat in dark holds aboard raider ships, their small voices whispering to each other, afraid but clinging to hope. Then through the metal walls they heard the thunder of weapons, the screams of alien crews, the echo of explosions, and suddenly light poured into the hold as human marines broke down the doors, their armor glowing with fire, their voices steady. "We are here, you are safe now." The children cried out in relief as they were lifted into strong arms, carried back into the light. Across the council chamber, panic spread. Chancellor Vaynard demanded reports, but every message was the same: human fleets advancing faster than expected, strongholds falling, entire sectors destabilized. The Chancellor's proud words from before now rang hollow, his counselors whispering among themselves, some demanding surrender, others insisting they stand strong. But fear was already spreading through their ranks. The unshakable myth of humanity had become living truth before their eyes. Alien civilians across the galaxy watched the destruction unfold. Many wept for fear that war would spread to their worlds, yet deep inside they understood why this was happening. They whispered that the Council had broken the first law, and now the punishment had come. Old races who remembered past wars shook their heads and warned that the storm had only begun. For humans did not stop at one victory, they did not stop at one retaliation. Once they were awakened, they carried the fight until justice was complete. On Earth, the people watched the return of their children broadcast live across networks. Every cry of relief, every smile of safety fueling their resolve, but it did not calm their rage. Instead, it sharpened it. The children were home, but the law had been broken, and the humans knew the lesson must be carved into the memory of the galaxy once more, for every star to remember. Admiral Kieran stood before his officers, his voice grim and steady. "We have rescued the innocent, but the Council must learn what they unleashed. We do not stop until their power is shattered, until no one dares again to think of harming our children. This is not vengeance alone, this is justice." And so the fleets pressed onward, stronger, larger, more determined than before. The shattering retaliation was not the end. It was the beginning of a war that would change the face of the galaxy forever. And those who had doubted now knew the meaning of the first law, carved not in treaties but in fire and blood: the judgment. The war burned across the stars, and every battle ended the same: human fleets striking with precision and fury. Council, defenses falling in fire, entire worlds surrendering before a single shot was fired, because the sight of human ships breaking through the skies was enough to shatter the will of entire armies. The message spread through the galaxy faster than the ships themselves. The first law had been broken, and humanity had risen to enforce it. No one doubted anymore. It was not long before the first Council leaders were captured. Fleets were shattered, and their admirals dragged in chains before human commanders. Worlds once thought untouchable now lay exposed, their governors trembling before the justice they had mocked. Chancellor Vaynard himself, once so proud, was cornered on his homeworld, his fleets gone, his defenses crumbling, his palace surrounded by human marines, their armor dark and unyielding. He tried to raise his voice in defiance, but his words faltered when he saw the eyes of those who had come for him. The captured leaders were taken not to dungeons but to great halls of judgment, where the galaxy itself was invited to witness the trials. Humanity wanted no secret vengeance, no whispered rumors. They wanted every star, every race, every child, and every parent to see what happens when the first law is broken. The chambers were filled with lights and cameras broadcasting across networks to every corner of the galaxy. Billions watched as the leaders were brought forward, chains clattering against the floors, their faces pale with fear. Ambassador Theron of the Yalari, who had tried to warn the Council, sat among the witnesses, her luminous eyes filled with sorrow. She spoke softly to those around her, saying the law was clear. The punishment was inevitable, and now the galaxy must learn to never forget what was done. The human representatives stood tall, their voices steady as they laid the charges: crimes against the innocent, crimes against the future, crimes against the first law. The words echoed like thunder across the chamber. One by one, the leaders tried to defend themselves. Some claimed ignorance, some blamed others. Some insisted they were following orders, but their excuses fell silent before the truth. Records of their votes, messages of their plotting, images of children dragged from homes, all shown on great screens until no one could deny their guilt. Chancellor Vaynard raised his voice in desperation, insisting the humans were tyrants, that the galaxy should not bend before them. But his words only drew silence. No applause, no support. The Council, that had once cheered him, now looked away, ashamed and broken. The judgment was swift. The guilty were sentenced to exile, their worlds stripped of power, their fleets dismantled, and their names marked in history as betrayers of the galaxy. Some begged for mercy, some wept, but none were spared, for the children's cries had been louder than their pleas. Humanity's justice was final, and it was not only vengeance. It was a warning carved into the memory of every witness. Across the stars, alien citizens who had feared humanity now felt something else: respect and understanding. Many spoke to their young of what they had seen, reminding them why the first law must never be touched again. Markets quieted, ports fell silent, entire planets lit candles, in remembrance of the children taken and returned, for they knew the war was not only about humanity, it was about the safety of all. It was about the rule that protected the most innocent in a galaxy of endless conflict. On Earth, the returned children were carried through streets lined with millions, their faces lit with joy and sorrow. Parents wept as they embraced them, but even in their happiness, there was steel in their voices. They demanded that the law be reforged stronger than ever, so that no one would ever dare again. Human leaders answered with vows sworn before all the stars that the law would stand forever, and that if it were tested again, the punishment would be worse than anyone could imagine. And so the trials ended, but the war was not yet over, for though the guilty had been judged, humanity still had to reshape the galaxy and ensure that every world knew the cost of betrayal. The fleets did not return home. They stood ready, engines burning, watching the council worlds, with eyes that promised no second chances. The galaxy had witnessed judgment, but it waited in silence for the final word, for the declaration that would bind the stars to a new age. The new law. The stars had burned with war, the council had been broken, the guilty had been judged. Yet the galaxy still waited in silence for what humanity would say next, because the first law had been broken, and though punishment had fallen, the question remained. What would become of the galaxy after such fire? Entire fleets drifted as wrecks, entire worlds bore the scars of invasion and retaliation. But above all, hearts trembled with the knowledge that the law that once protected the innocent had been ignored, and so it needed to be reforged on Earth. Leaders gathered, not only humans, but also ambassadors of allied species, those who had stood by them or warned against the crime, those who had shared in sorrow and had seen the danger of pride. In the Grand Assembly Hall, voices fell silent as Admiral Kieran entered. Not as a soldier now, but as the voice of humanity. Behind him marched veterans, parents, and even the children who had been rescued, their presence a living symbol of why the law existed. The room held its breath as the Admiral spoke his words, carrying across networks into every home, every station, every world. He said the first law of the galaxy was written in blood and in tears. It was not a treaty signed by politicians. It was not a myth. It was a truth carved into history, and when it was broken, the galaxy saw what followed. He said humanity did not rise for conquest or power. Humanity rose because its children were harmed. And there is no greater crime, he declared, that from this day forward the law was no longer simply a council order. It was a sacred commandment bound not only by fear but by honor. The law was spoken again before all. Do not harm human children. Do not threaten them. Do not take them, for if one child is harmed, the full wrath of humanity will fall without mercy and without hesitation. Yet this time the vow was stronger than before, for humanity pledged not only to protect their own children, but to stand for the children of all species who lived under the council. They declared that the weak, the small, the innocent were not pawns in wars or games of power. They were the future, and anyone who tried to hurt them would face the same fate. The words were met with silence first, then with a wave of agreement. Even species who once feared or hated humans bowed their heads, for they had seen the truth of those words. They had seen the war and the justice that followed the galaxy, understood at last that the first law was not only about humanity, it was about survival, about protecting what was most precious in a universe filled with danger. The law was reforged, not just in treaties, but in the hearts of billions. The fleets of humanity did not retreat entirely. They remained, as guardians in the skies around vulnerable colonies, their black hulls a reminder of what had been unleashed, but also a shield against the arrogance of leaders who might forget. Again the message was clear. The law was eternal, and its enforcers were awake. On new dawn, where the first crime had taken place, the children who had been rescued returned to their homes, their laughter filling the air once more. Though the scars of fire and war still marked the land, their voices brought healing. Parents wept as they watched them play again under the twin suns, their hearts heavy yet hopeful, because they knew the galaxy would never again take their safety for granted. Chancellor Vaynar and those who had led the betrayal faded into exile, their names cursed across history. The council itself shattered and rebuilt with new voices, new promises, and new understanding. But even with new laws and reforms, everyone knew the true power that kept the galaxy in balance was not written in chambers, but carried in the memory of the storm humanity had shown. As the sun set across Earth, Admiral Kieran stood alone at the edge of the great ocean, his reflection broken by the waves. He thought of the battles fought, the lives lost, and the children saved. He whispered to the wind that this war must be the last, that no child of any race should ever again live in fear, and he vowed that as long as humanity endured, the law would endure with them. The galaxy turned slowly toward peace, its people humbled its leaders, chastened its children safer than before. And in the silence that followed the war, one truth rang louder than any other. The first law of the galaxy was not a myth, it was eternal, and it was now bound not only by fear, but by the unshakable will of humanity, the eternal law. The galaxy settled into silence after the storm, but that silence was not the same as before. It was deeper, heavier, carrying the weight of memory across every world. The stars themselves seemed to remember the fire that had passed through them, and in that memory was a lesson carved into eternity. Never again would any voice dare to rise in defiance of the law that had been reforged. In the council chambers rebuilt from the ruins of pride, leaders of countless species gathered, and for the first time in living memory, there was no arrogance in their voices, only humility and respect. They looked toward the human delegation, and they did not see conquerors, they saw guardians. They saw a people who had burned half the galaxy, not for power, not for gold, not for territory, but for the lives of their children. They saw a fire that could never be bought or bent, and in that realization they understood why the first law was sacred among the people of the galaxy. The story spread as legend. Children of every race learned it as their first lesson. Mothers and fathers told it in hushed voices, teachers spoke of it in classrooms, storytellers sang of it in markets. The tale of the day, the council, broke the law, and the humans answered with thunder and vengeance. It became more than history. It became a warning and also a promise that the smallest among them would never again be left defenseless. Humanity itself did not return to the shadows of peace without duty. Their fleet stood watch in the far corners of space. Black ships with bright banners that carried the oath of protection. Colonies that once feared raids now slept beneath the shield of human guardians, and even alien children who had once been taught to fear humans now looked to them with wide eyes and whispered that they were safe. Because of the humans, Admiral Kieran, whose name had become a symbol of wrath, lived long enough to see the galaxy bend not to chains but to respect. His hair grew white and his hands grew old, but his voice never wavered when he repeated the words that bound the stars: harm no child or face the storm. He passed away with those words on his lips, and his name joined the legends of humanity, his memory carried by generations. On the colony of New Dawn, where the law had been broken, first children grew strong again, their laughter carried by twin suns, their voices free of fear, and every year they held a day of remembrance. Not in sorrow, but in strength, they walked through the fields where fire had once fallen, and planted seeds that grew into forests of light, each tree a promise that the future would never again be taken from them. The galaxy moved forward with scars, but also with hope. The council was reshaped into something stronger, not because of laws written on stone or crystal, but because of the will of a people who had proven what mattered most. The innocent became untouchable. The children became the most guarded treasure of the stars, and behind it all stood the shadow of humanity, a shadow that brought fear to the guilty and peace to the innocent. The first law of the galaxy lived eternal, carried not in fear alone, but in respect and in memory. The galaxy would never forget the day it was broken, and the storm that followed, for that storm had remade the stars and bound them in a vow stronger than any fleet or fortress. And so the story ended, but the lesson remained, written in fire, written in blood, written in love for the young. Never harm the children of humanity, never harm the future of the galaxy.